So thank you all again for coming out to Nature Speaks. Nature Speaks is our series that we're in partnership with the Prospect Heights Natural Resource Commission. I'm Terri Campbell. I'm the Adult Program Coordinator here at the library. Our speaker tonight is a master storyteller, restoration and conservation icon. Stephen Packard will be sharing his adventures in Chicagoland conservation. So please welcome Stephen Packard.
I love telling stories. I really hope my voice holds out because I like to tell stories about great people who are regular people who have done great things for nature. As when you spread the word around, people learn from each other, and more people do this kind of great stuff. I want to start with a couple of historic stories about great ideas and not quite so great ideas. The first one is should be a widely appreciated founding document for the Midwest. It's a letter I ran across doing some research, an exchange of letters between Thomas Jefferson and George Rogers Clark. George Rogers Clark captured Illinois for the Revolution in 1779. Jefferson said, "Why didn't you go out and get rid of those British? They're running things from the fort at Vincennes, and I'll make you a brigadier general," or I forget he gave him no money, no troops, no weapons, but he made him a brigadier general and said, "Get your stuff together and go out there and capture Illinois, will you?" So he came out with 140 men, and they walked. And they first captured a couple of towns in southern Illinois. That's the only place there were towns, Kaskaskia and a couple down there. And when they'd capture a town, they'd say, "Join the army or don't. If you do, maybe you'll be a leader in this new thing we're doing here." And a lot of people in the towns joined his little army. I'll tell you why in a minute, but first I'll tell you, they then walked across Illinois in February from the Mississippi to the Wabash. And they walked, it wasn't frozen, they walked in water up to their knees for days, going across the prairie where it was flat and wet and flooded. They got to the fort at Vincennes, and their ammunition was wet, the people were exhausted, they'd run out of food. There was a little village there, and the village didn't like the British, fortunately for them. So they gave them dry powder and shut up about the fact that they were getting ready to attack the fort. And then George Rogers Clark, there was a little place where they could walk over a rise, and he had the drummer walk and the people walk over this, his soldiers, and then they would run around and go over it again, and run around and go over it again. It looked like they were quite an impressive force, and the much larger force inside the fort that was well armed surrendered. Here's how he built up his army, though, and this is what he told Jefferson about. Jefferson is trying to be a good mentor to this very rough backwoodsman type who he's talking to. And Clark says, "Here's what we do. We go in and capture a village. And then we assemble the people and say, you can go with America, you can go with Britain. Here's the deal. Britain is setting up these forts, they're setting up these magistrates and all. When you're with the king, as you know, you want to cut a tree down, you ask for permission. If you want to start a farm somewhere, you have to get it approved. If you want to dam a stream to make a pond, it has to go through somebody who tells you yes or no. Here's the deal if you're American. If you want to do it, you do it. You cut down a tree, it's your tree. You build a log house on a piece of land, that's your house, that's your land. You start to farm, that's your farm. We don't take anything away from you. America's about freedom, opportunity. Take advantage of it. People like the pitch. And it resulted in an impressive initiative and creativity, and it just worked perfectly for a while. Just take anything from the environment, it's yours, you got it, don't worry. And then later that would start doing a little less well. I guess we'll get to that. The other, next thing I wanted to do is give you an example of a minor theme in my talk tonight, bad ideas. This comes from 8 years later. James Monroe wrote, we would say today, a memo. He wrote a letter to Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson said, can you figure out what all that land is that we captured out there? We want to know about it. And so James Monroe came out here, he boated down the Illinois River and the Mississippi, and this is the report he wrote. A great part of the territory is miserably poor, especially near Lakes Michigan and Erie, and that upon the Mississippi and Illinois consists of extensive plains which have not from appearances and will not have a single bush on them for ages. The districts, therefore, within which these fall will never contain a sufficient number of inhabitants to entitle them to membership in the Confederacy. Well, it didn't end up being the Confederacy. And he had been thinking that because it didn't grow trees, the land was no good, instead of being about the richest, well-watered soil on the planet. And we started using it, and we used it, and it pretty much all started going away. Some people noticed. And I want to talk about a little group of regular, great people that formed a little social group around 1900, 70 years after, 100 years after, a little more than 100 years after George Rogers Clark and James Monroe. They were in Evanston, Illinois, and they humbly called themselves the Committee on the Universe. And among the members of this little group were Jane Addams, Frank Lloyd Wright, Dwight Perkins, people no one had heard of at the time because they hadn't done anything worthy of hearing of them. But they had ideas, and they thought about them. They were just young professionals, basically. They had ideas, and they encouraged each other in carrying them out. Jane Addams won the Nobel Prize for the idea that came out of this group. Let's welcome people who are coming here. They said together, there's going to be a metropolis here. There's going to be a culture. We need to help this culture come into being. We need to be part of it. We need to think it through. There's stuff we should think through before it just happens any old way. And so Jane Addams said, let's open settlement houses that welcome refugees, immigrants from many kinds are coming here. They speak various languages. They're bringing various customs with them. There's a certain amount of conflict. Let's start these institutions that welcome people, encourage and support them into saving the best of their cultures that are bringing with them, and help them become part of this larger culture here. Frank Lloyd Wright developed a prairie style of architecture. Dwight Perkins had a profoundly important idea. He said nature is going away. Let's be a metropolis that saves some nature. And they thought up the idea of forest preserve districts. And he worked on it for 15 years, every weekend, all weekend, 2 or 3 nights a week, because the idea kept getting shot down and take it to the legislature and get passed and declared unconstitutional. He went and went, finally got it up and running. The Forest Preserve District, there was nothing like it in the world. It said, we are going to save nature, the flora and fauna in its natural state and condition as near as may be for the education, recreation, and pleasure of the public. That's this wonderful founding document. And I love this quotation from the 1921 report to the public of the Forest Preserve District. It references a goodly company of responsible citizens acting as wardens without pay, members of the Audubon Society, Boy Scouts, Campfire Girls, the Prairie Club, the Friends of Our Native Landscape, and the Wildflower Society. And this wonderful bunch of people said, this is important to our culture. We're going to do this, we're going to protect it, it's going to be good. Unfortunately, after 1920 and before the 1970s, as in Langham Island, somehow the culture fell apart to some degree and people forgot about the forest preserves. But a few wonderful people came along, and great regular people, and changed the country once again. One of them was May Fieldgard Watts. She was an immigrant from Denmark. There was a strong nature culture in Denmark, and she thought there should be one here. And she started teaching classes at the Morton Arboretum. And still today, I meet people who studied with her and described how inspiring it was. One of the things she did was write a book called Reading the Landscape. And it talked about the prairies and the bogs and the fens and the oak woods and our native landscape, and conveyed it to people in a way that people were excited about it. Excited enough that she later wrote Reading the Landscape of America, and later after that wrote Reading the Landscape of Europe. There was something in the air here that was the fact that nature was going away so fast, I think, that made people pay more attention to it. Another person in the 60s, early 70s, was a fellow named George Fell, who was the first person in the country, the first person in the world to think of the idea of, what if we had a state nature preserves commission that had the ability to dedicate a piece of land as nature the same way you could dedicate a street. And once it was dedicated for nature, it was at its highest and best use for public purpose, and you couldn't take that away without such difficulty that of the couple hundred nature preserves, none has ever been taken away. Some, like Langham Island, haven't had as good care taken of them as they need to be. A wonderful book was just written about him called Force of Nature, George Fell. Another fellow was Dr. Robert Betts, who went around preaching like an Old Testament prophet about the prairie, how rich and wonderful it was. And people started learning these rare plants and what a real prairie looked like. And it's sort of like getting to really appreciate a Rembrandt or Leonardo if you you really study it, you get so much more out of it. Well, I want to sort of plug the Prospect Heights Natural Resources Commission for being a group that's teaching people about the prairie and the wetlands, getting people to feel it in their bones as they're stewards of it. And it's a group like the Committee on the Universe, except we have to think local sometimes. If we only think about the universe, we forget the local. So Dr. Betts did that. I I read his stuff and said, golly, there are prairies near me, we should take care of them. And got the Forest Preserve District to improve this thing. The North Branch Prairie Project along the North Branch of the Chicago River, we started taking care of these little prairies. And spread the word, people would come out, and person after person said, we're really needed for this. Let's do it. We're gonna do it. But one of my favorite memories of the North Branch Prairie Project was one time we were out cutting brush. It was a beautiful day in spring. Sun was shining. There was a little opening, little prairie opening among the trees. We were pushing the brush back. We stopped to have a break. We had wonderful fellowship during breaks. We sat down. One of us stood up and walked off into the brush for a little while for reasons known only to himself, and came back with a look of beatification on his face. He was just glowing. And we sort of looked at him and we said, you won't believe it. The woods are full of wild concubines. His name was Pete Baldo. He was a physicist at Argonne. He was an expert at many things. He was not an expert botanist. Many people could have told him the difference between concubines and columbines. But he was so much more important than a person who just knew the names of the plants, because he was doing something. He was changing the world. And this group worked and was on the TV and in the newspapers. And unexpectedly to me, George Fell hired me at that point. Said, could you help out the Nature Preserves Commission? We need some help. Sounds like you know how to get people doing stuff. And in fact, that was my job, going around to little groups like this and spreading the word and helping people become empowered to do what's good. I was soon engaged to help very near here. There's a little prairie in Palatine called Palatine Prairie on the corner of a flood retention basin. And my boss said, could you go there and dig up some endangered prairie lady slippers and move them to some place where they're going to survive, because the whole thing's going to be destroyed. I said, oh. Couldn't we save it? No, we can't. It's too late. So I went there with my shovel and a bucket. It was one of the first things I did working for the Illinois Nature Preserves Commission. I dug up 3 little clumps of lady slippers. I just looked at it, and I was in the middle of one of the rarest ecosystems on the planet, this beautiful, rich prairie. And I said, I must be crazy. What am I doing? This shouldn't be destroyed. How do I know that? So I called up the agency that owned it, the Water Reclamation District, and said, no, it's too late, nothing can be done. And I went down there and I said, let's talk about it. And I said, no, don't talk. Nothing can be done. It's too late. And I said, could I look at the plans? I'm from the Illinois Nature Preserves Commission, a state agency. Yeah, you can look at the plans. So I looked at them, and the prairie is just one little corner of it. And the plan said that we would dig this retention basin and dump the spoils on top of the prairie, and then finish the retention basin, and then put the spoils back into a big sled hill in the middle of the site. And I said, what if you dump the spoils over here instead of over here? And I said, oh, we can do that. So the first part had been done. Palatine Prairie was not going to be buried. But then somebody has to take care of it. And I traveled around and met people. There's a wonderful woman named Rose Buchanan who lived in Palatine. She knew a little bit about Prairie. She had friends. We had a meeting at her house. Two of her older friends said, oh yes, that area. We remember when the prairie chickens used to boom there.
Wow.
Our inhabitation of this area is short. Many of the big trees in the woods have been here twice as long as our civilization has been here. So these wonderful people started taking care of Palatine Prairie. And then Prairie Woods Audubon adopted it. And people have been working there ever since. As we did more and more of this and got more and more recognized, I approached the forest preserve. What if we did something really big? I said, well, maybe. And so this went back and forth for a while. And they agreed, let's restore 500 acres at Poplar Creek Forest Preserve. And let's have a big kickoff event and see if anybody shows up. And Dr. Betts gave a wonderful speech and about how wonderful the prairie was. And there were these big rolling fields of European grasses that had been planted in a beautiful original prairie that could be expanded. And I didn't know if anyone would show up. My theory was it would be a group about this size maybe, or maybe half this big, or maybe 10. And we'd walk around and I'd talk to them and show them, here's what the possibilities are, what do you think? 80 people showed up. It was thrilling. It just meant people care about this stuff. But I looked at them and I said, I cannot take 80 people out and have a sensible discussion. So I got up in front and I said, I'll tell you what, it's wonderful. We have a few people here who can lead tours, but I have some prior business. Are there people here who would be willing to start in and learn to be leaders so that these 80 people will all have a structure and we can educated leadership, work a little harder? A dozen people raised their hands, and I said, oh, good. Meet me right now over under that tree. I'm turning over the podium to the tour leaders, and we went over under the tree and we talked just for a minute, described the opportunities, the possibilities. And one person said, I'll edit the newsletter. Someone said, I've cleared brush before. I could teach people how to clear brush. Someone said, I did burning with the Forest Service in the West. I could lead the controlled burns. Someone said, I love seeds. I love gardening. And pretty soon, there was a community that celebrated its 25th anniversary in 2014. People have gotten married, had kids, kids have grown up, and it's this group that, if all goes well, will continue like a church congregation or a school board, or bit by bit they're doing wonderful things. At Poplar Creek, a young fellow named Rich McCandless became one of the co-volunteer stewards. He ended up moving to this professionally. His partner, Carly Kreider, was personnel, creative, wonderful personnel head for a high-tech company nearby. She said, I'll do the human resources. We'll recruit. We'll welcome people to work at us. We'll have parties. We'll recruit people for the newsletter. And And all these wonderful creative people just started doing it. It's in the mold of the Prospect Heights Natural Resources Commission and the North Branch Prairie Project and the Committee on the Universe. One of my favorite projects that we started about this time, some of the Cook County commissioners said, there's a lot of inner city people that don't care about forest preserves, so why should we keep appropriating money for it? I said, I think everybody cares. Some people don't get exposed as often, so we started this wonderful group called the Mighty Acorns. And it was, schools would provide buses, take classes out to the forest preserve. The kids would spend the first half of the day cutting brush or picking seeds or doing work to help the animals in their habitats. And then the second half they would explore in small groups with mentors, 5 or 6 kids at a time, so they could be free to explore on their own. It was a wonderful thing. And one of the hundreds of wonderful volunteers who became the mentors came up to me one day and said, I live in the innermost city of neighborhoods, Fuller Park. The kids love this so much, it's not enough for them. They get this 3 times in their life. Once in fall, once in winter, once in spring of their 4th grade. They need it all the time, every day. I said, yeah, it's true. He said, well, so? I said, good point. Find some land in Fuller Park, get something started. Let me help however I can, but you'd have to do it. And he said, well, I don't know, it's park. There's a rubble-strewn lot not too far from along the railroad tracks. It's covered with garbage. I said, that's interesting. One of the volunteers on the North Branch, Karen Rodriguez, works for the EPA. Why don't you talk to her about that lot? And the EPA went and looked at it and said, this is all toxic. Whoever owns this is committing an atrocity by letting this happen. She talked to the city, and together they talked to the owner and said, so, like monumental fines, or would you like to give this worthless junk away that you haven't been paying taxes on anyway? And they said, give it away. And so they gave it to Michael Howard, set up a little foundation. The city cleaned the worst of the garbage off, and then the neighbors, especially the kids, cleaned and piled and planted and made a little prairie and made a little woodland, made gardens, made ponds. And they called it Eden Place. And they started having job training and seasonal festivals. And it's going to this day, this wonderful thing, Eden Place. Everybody can do it. One of the things people can do is talk about it to people who might be interested and who might be looking for an outlet. Some of the most important people in the world are people called connectors. They find people, they notice them, they suggest opportunities, they put them in touch with other people. Maybe we have some connectors in the audience tonight. Another big project these projects got bigger and bigger. Another big project called the Orland Grassland down in Orland Park. There was a 960-acre parcel which had been famous for grassland birds. It had all been prairie. Then it was farmed, then it was bought by the Forest Preserve District, then it was left alone. And there's some little patches of prairie and these wonderful, now very rare prairie birds, breeding prairie birds, bobolinks, meadowlarks, short-eared owls, Henslow sparrows, dickcissels. You don't see them every day. And the birders started reporting they're going away. And if you went there and looked at it, it was easy to see why. The brush was growing up everywhere. So we said, let's see what we can do down there. Forest Preserve, want to do this? And once again, they said, yeah, well, I don't know, we don't have any money. And the Open Lands Project said, we actually have some money from a fine that came to us through a court settlement from a big company that did bad things, and we need something positive for the ecosystem to do with that money. Maybe we could put $500,000 into it. Oh, that sounded good. The Forest Preserve District said, well, maybe. But first, we would have to talk to the mayor. If the mayor doesn't approve this, the community doesn't approve it, we can't do it. So I said, okay. 2 months later, if you talk to the mayor, I have not had time. A month later, no. Joe Roth from Open Lands called up the mayor and said, I'm from a group where we'd give $500,000 to help spruce up this forest preserve. Is that a good idea? Yeah, it's a great idea. We'll send you the plan. And they had a professional plan made up. Jerry Wilhelm, who has spoken or will speak here, as I understand, was the principal author on the plan. It was a great plan. He said, we'll do it. And so Joe Roth called the Forest Preserve director and said, okay, we're ready. The mayor signed up. And the director said, oh, sure, the mayor agrees. And as soon as it started, its commissioners, we're going to be cutting trees down. People are going to be mad. They don't want fire. I mean, maybe it's good, but let's sit on it for a while. So then Joe Roth went to the mayor. The mayor gave the plan to the city council. The city council discussed it. It was a unanimous, wonderful, we're going ahead with this. And the Forest Preserve said, oh, sure, the elected council approved it, but the neighbors are going to object, the public will be up in arms. And so we said, okay, we'll have a public meeting. It'll be sponsored by Open Lands, Audubon, which is where I was at the time, and the village of Orland Park. And we announced it and set a date and said, Forest Preserve, please show up at this meeting that you're co-sponsoring on this important project. And we never heard anything back from them. They did finally send someone at the last minute, and a very good person, but wasn't authorized to say anything. But there were these great presentations. Sorry. This is comic relief. There was huge support. 2 Forest Preserve commissioners came. They said, this is great. You'll take us over to see this place. Tons of people signed up to be volunteers. And we went ahead. And not only was it a spectacular, wonderful thing that now looks like our little Serengeti and walk through in the evening. There's a bunch of coyotes and a bunch of deer and short-eared owls and harriers and just this, depending on the season, wonderful sounds and smells in the air. But it was truly adopted by the community, so much so that when Orland Park built a new library, they hired a National Geographic illustrator to do a 25-foot mural that's the highlight of the library that shows the Orland grassland after the restoration has been completed. Beautiful prairies and savannas with all these animals showing the underground and people out in there. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing. They adopted it sufficiently that when the volunteer group down there, the Orland Grassland volunteers appealed to our federal elected officials for some help. Here we've got a handful, I mean, it's a group the size of this group that's in charge of 960 acres. I think everyone will realize that's a challenge. The Forest Preserve has some staff, but hardly any for, it's wonderful that they have 79,000 acres, but you know, they don't have a land management person for, it adds up to like one for well, at least at the time, for 10,000 acres, or I forget. In any case, they just know they cannot do all the detailed work that the land deserves without the help of volunteers, and they've come to really appreciate the volunteer component. So, in any case, the volunteers appealed to a federal representative, can you get us some money to help us with this? And Congressman Judy Biggert looked at it and said, oh, this is very important. We do need to do more for the natural ecosystem. We do need more for the nature culture of our communities. The high schools have adopted this. Yes, and they appropriated $7 million for restoration of these 960 acres, which created an odd problem. The Corps of Engineers took on this project, and we were trying to teach them how to do it. And they appreciated having an important, good thing to do that would be appreciated by the public. But in the meantime, much of what the volunteer crew was doing didn't make sense anymore. They were cutting the brush with huge machines, like you clear the tropical rainforest, which aren't good in that case, but in this case, they could clear massive amounts of brush. And they're going to be there doing a lot of the important work for, I think, 4 or 5 years. And the Orland Grassland volunteers said, how can we best spend our time while we're being outcompeted by giant machines? And they said, you know, we really need the local seed. And we should be going out and finding the local ecotype so that there'll be as much local seed in the restoration as possible. And it turned out that there's one of the finest prairies in the state along an old railroad right-of-way, runs right close by. It's a dedicated nature preserve, I remembered. So I went down and took a look at it, wondering, would the Nature Preserves Commission, they're kind of fussy about taking stuff away from a nature preserve for good reason. So I went down and looked at it to see maybe there's a huge amount of certain things. And I walked down it, I hadn't seen it for 20 years, and my heart sank. It was all brush and invasive teasel and crown vetch, and it had just been let go. It had been dedicated as a nature preserve, like Langham Island. It had no committee on the universe. It had no committee on the local prairie. So I called up the Nature Preserves Commission and said, how about a deal? The Orland Grassland volunteers will try and whip this place back into shape if you let them take a tolerable amount of seed. And they said, great idea. And so this wonderful group then, now we're the stewards of one of the highest quality prairies. Little bits of it were surviving, and they could push the evil back and heal it. And they've been doing it ever since. It's a wonderful thing. One of the next challenges that I faced was these areas high-quality areas were so small that although we began to get Poplar Creek, we began to get the Orland grassland, none of them were really as big as, I guess, conservation vision would hope for. And so I went to Springfield with some other experts and talked the state Department of Natural Resources, and there's this group that sort of oversees the nature preserve system, professors in the state colleges around the state and a variety of people. And the priority for some time had been save the highest quality remnants. There was not a single prairie in the state big enough for a single pair of prairie birds to breed on. It was really high quality. And so we said, what if we said, we'll find the large grade C areas and we'll nurse them back to health, but we'll try and find some really big ones. Should that be part of our should it be part of what conservation does? And one of the big challenges was we didn't have any savannas. A savanna is something like a prairie, but it's got oak trees dotted over and has totally different animals and birds, many different snakes, butterflies, many different plants that are plants of the savanna. And we basically didn't have any high quality ones. They needed size. And so we tried to convince the reigning experts that this was a good idea. And one of the greats, PhD, pounded the table and said, they're gone, gone, gone. You can't bring them back. When they're gone, they're gone. So yeah, you don't know that. Science is stuff that you've tried to, and you want to see if it works or not. Let's try one, let's see if it works. And the discussion went around for a while. And slowly people came around and said, oh, sure, it might catch people's imagination. Might work better than we think. So we said, where is there a big grassland, a big savanna prairie complex somewhere? I said, well, that's the problem, there aren't any. Well, just think about it. The people in this room know the state better than anybody in the world. And finally, state botanist John Schwegman said, there is this place up by Dixon, where Ronald Reagan was a lifeguard, that sort of looks, it might be the sort of thing you're talking about, up in Nachusa Township. So we went and looked at it. There's this place that we subsequently called Nachusa Grasslands. Said, let's start buying this. And so the Nature Conservancy started buying it. We started restoring, we started buying a little more. Prairie, savanna, marshes, woodlands, rock outcrops. It's an amazing, beautiful place. It has gotten bigger and better and bigger and better. The Paul Swanson in the room here today lives around here, but he's a volunteer at Nachusa Grasslands. It's a wonderful place. One of my friends went out there to take photographs of birds. It's just filled with rare birds. But he brought photographs of a golden eagle chasing a full-grown deer, diving at it, fur flying, the deer saying, what is this thing? Doesn't happen very often, but it's the kind of place that attracts that kind of thing. When we started it, we said, this needs to be big enough for bison. It was a vision in the far future at that time. But we said, let's start right in. We'll start putting posts. We'll make a bison fence. We'll have a bison-sized fence. And some of the local people said, "You're crazy, that little fence is gonna hold a bison." But the Nature Conservancy had prairies in Nebraska where we're bringing bison back, bringing bison back to the prairie. And so I talked with our expert out there, and he said, "Well, I'll tell you about it. The fence by itself, it's very expensive to build a fence that would like totally 100% hold a bison, hold in a big male bison. But the trick is you manage them. You burn over here. They love to eat where it's recently burned. They go there. You burn over here. Here's the thing to do. Don't have anything right outside the fence that they really want. And then you can do, this and that." And he said one of the most profound things that I've ever heard, so I'll pass it on to you. He said, if you really know what you're doing, you can get bison to do anything that they want to do. And I think we should think of that as a way to work with other people as well. So the bison are back at Wachusett. It's a wonderful place. It's the only tallgrass prairie in the east that has them back, and we will discover wonderful things there. Next challenge that came up, we started working on these savannas and learning about oak woodlands, and the Nature Preserves Commission did not approve burning them, and it was increasingly clear that they were utterly dependent on burning, couldn't do it any other way. And I wasn't getting anywhere trying to get them to do what they wanted to do and burn the woods, or to approve it anywhere. So I got together with Jerry Wilhelm, Dr. Betts, Dr. Ebinger from Eastern Illinois University, who'd been studying this, and we wrote a joint letter to the Nature Preserves Commission. Would you please approve burning in oak woodlands on an experimental basis? And the chair of the Nature Preserves Commission barged into my office, waving his arms. He slammed a book down on my desk, said, "You will destroy the Nature Preserves Commission, these crazy radical ideas. There are houses around these that will burn people. No one will agree to serve on the commission anymore. We'll all get sued." Well, I don't think that's so. It'll be, and so the Nature Preserves Commission had to do something with this letter that was written. It was on the docket for the commission meeting, and the chairman said, "Item 7241, burning in woodlands. We're not going to discuss that because the commission does not approve vague things in concept. There would have to be a specific plan for burning a specific woodland with appropriate studies." And you imagine that would stall things off for a long time. When the meeting was packed, by the way, because people had heard about this, and it was out in Rockford, I think. It was packed. And after the meeting, this woman came up to me and said, "I have a nature preserve woodland that I donated that's now owned by, my name is Barbara Turner, and there's this woodland, Reed Turner woodland, and I've seen it since it's been made a nature preserve, grow in with brush. It's terrible, and I understand what you're talking about. I can, like this, get approval from the board, which I'm the chair of, to burn it." And Jerry Wilhelm was at the meeting, and he said, "I'll do the study for free." And I said to Barbara Turner, "This is a wonderful thing that you take such initiative in so many ways. what inspires you? And she said, oh, I was a student of May Thielgard Watts. So it's this chain that comes down from person to person, from generation to generation. I sort of have to keep it up. And the study was done. There was a howling success. And the secret of it is little Prospect Heights Natural Resource Commissions, little Reed Turner Woodland Stewardship Committees, Long Grove Park District that owns it, the Audubon Society and the Nature Conservancy, and the Forest Preserve District of Cook County that so much is looking for more volunteers for Deer Grove and Poplar Creek and along the Des Plaines and the North Branch. So I encourage you all to spread the word and come out and do physical work, come out, gather seeds, take photos, write, Facebook, tweet, and we'll all be honorary members of the Committee on the Universe. Thank you. I was late getting started. I talked less than an hour, which was supposed to be the meeting. And I wondered, do we have time for discussion, questions? It is late.
I do have a question. Could you talk a little bit about your work at Stone Prairie?
Sure. It's like saying, would you be willing to show photos of your grandchildren? The Stone Prairie is the Stone Preserve is actually a complex of prairie to the west and savanna and then woodland. They're all there, the whole continuum. The fires that these ecosystems were so dependent on would tend to blow in for the wind from the west. So the western part is prairie. And then there's a morainal slope that was savanna, and then going down the other side where the fires would be the least ferocious was an oak woodland. Not a maple woodland, which would be a woodland that didn't burn, but an oak woodland. And when we started, we thought the only thing to do was the prairie. Let's cut all the trees down. Dr. Betts came and looked at it and said, yeah, that's great. Clear as much as possible because the prairie is so small that we just need to get them bigger. And we started doing that. And one day, Pete Baldo saw wild concubines in the woods. And we started looking at the woods more carefully, and we found that much that was rare and beautiful was in the woods too. And we said, I wonder if that's another ecosystem that has been forgotten about. And that was the beginning of savanna restoration in the region. We started saying, I guess we don't cut the oak trees. Later we started saying, oh, also not the plum trees and the hazelnut bushes and the Iowa crab and the nannyberries. And oh, there are different kinds of, we've got the prairie on the west, and we can make that gradually. It's like a prairie is an ecosystem with hundreds of species, now very rare, that if you give it a chance, burn, cut the brush back, it can grow. Go out and get the savanna on It turns out when we really studied the savanna portion, which we call Sown Prairie Grove, we found 240 species of native plants. We've subsequently restored more than 250 additional species of rare plants that survive here and there. You find one along a railroad track or in the back corner of an old cemetery or whatever. And they're taking over. And it turns out people said, well, the savanna, it's not really much of anything. There's the prairie, there's the forest, and the savanna is just a little transition between. Turns out there's a whole ton of birds that don't live in the forest and don't live in the prairie, but live in the savanna. And that was a clue to us that we should look at it more carefully. Oh, there's a bunch of butterflies. Oh, there are snakes. Nice snakes. And then more recently, a foundation said, we have a little money if you want an organizer to help make a bigger project, which was good. What we really needed was the Forest Preserve District's approval, and that helped with that. So we started a whole new section that went all the way through the woods in the east part of Sown. 3 of the wonderful new Sown East leaders are here tonight. Russ, Erico, and Paul. And ask them questions after it's over. But one of the things that we started doing there, someone said, we should have micro stewards. It's too much work to be a steward for a lot of people, but we could do parts of the job. So some people said, I'll work on the trails. People said, I'll take this section and study the ecosystem and do the planning. And so all kinds of wonderful new things are happening there. And it turns out that there are a lot of woodland birds that die out when there's dense buckthorn. And there's still enough around that they can come back when you start taking care of the woods. So for example, the woodcock is a bird people don't think of as living in the woods because they're not fit anymore. We started clearing out the buckthorn. The woodcocks came back and they do their spectacular mating dances and flights, and they bring up their adorable little chicks in the woods. The red-headed woodpecker once was a very common bird. All woodpeckers have some red on their head, but this one is just striking. The whole top of the body is red and huge black and white patches. John Fitzpatrick, the head of the Cornell Bird Observatory, one of the experts on North American birds, said a while back, the red-headed woodpecker, formerly very common, is decreasing so fast that if trends continue, it will be extinct in my lifetime, and I'm not young. And so much is happening to the environment that people, we have to shake ourselves.